there's a huge conversation we have about right size models around resource usage, and like making sure you like, for example, I'll give you a right now in Copilot, you have you can be typing and it can give you code completions as you're typing, or you can ask a question in the chat interface and it gives you a response. When you're typing, the LLM behind that model is actually today, it changes over time because we keep incrementing models, we keep improving things. Right now, it's GPT 3.5 Turbo is the model that it's talking to. If you're using the chat interface and then some other areas, that's using GPT-4. And so GPT-4, significantly greater context, oftentimes better results based on the context you're giving it. But the amount of energy consumption per transaction, the amount of resource consumption per transaction is a lot greater. If you're typing, you maybe don't need all that, and the amount of completion it's giving you is typically 1 line, 1 to 3 lines kind of thing. It's not a huge amount that it's doing. So we can use a smaller model that's faster, more energy efficient, and gives you the responses back quicker.
My name is Skulk Nietling, and this is the Mechanical Ink podcast, a podcast about open source, the open web, sustainability, and those who want to make the web and the world a better place. Hey, Martin. Welcome to the Mechanical Ink podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's great to finally get to chat to you.
Yeah, it took a while. Normally that's what happens if you try to do anything in December, right?
Yeah, indeed. But no, it's a beautiful day over here in Northern Ireland now, so it's good to finally speak.
Nice. And then last week we would have done this, but then Snow decided, no, you're going to wait another week.
Yeah, we had snow and wind. It's extreme weather sort of thing. So it kind of, a lot of people here had power issues and things. So, but yeah, I'm glad to finally get to chat with you. So this is good fun. I'm looking to diving in.
Yeah. So before we do dive in to the Octoverse, if you want to give us an introduction to who Martin Woodward is.
Sure. So I'm Martin Woodward. I'm VP of Developer Relations over at GitHub, which is a fancy sounding title, but basically I just help the company make sure we understand developers and kind of put the nerd cred into GitHub. And then from developers' point of view, make sure we're being listened to inside the company, making sure open source communities are understood and like their needs are taken into account as teams are building features, that sort of thing. So that's my job, based in Northern Ireland, but obviously GitHub's a fully remote company, so my team's kind of spread around the world, helping people in their communities. So yeah, it's probably the best job in the world, but it is pretty awesome. So I love it here.
How'd you end up there?
Oh man, yeah. So I did a start, probably like I had a real job for many, many years, and I would do kind of like working in banks and insurance companies and all the boring stuff and consultancy and things. And when I was I kind of straddled this world between kind of .NET and Java sort of space. And so when I was doing a paid gig that was in, say, the .NET Microsoft-y technologies, I would go do open source in some of the Java technologies or go do some Linux stuff or whatever. And then when I was getting paid to do Java stuff or Linuxy stuff or Mac stuff, I would go do some open source on the .NET side, on the Microsoft side, to again keep my skills up to date, just kind of scratch that itch, especially if you're in corporate jobs. There's usually lots of room to scratch itches and things which you can't do during your day job. And so that's how I got into open source. And then I there's a particular problem that I wanted to solve in the open source world, and kind of met with a bunch of friends. And then we ended up getting called by magazines and companies wanting to basically talk about this thing we were building and kind of buy this thing we were building. And I was like, oh, hang on a minute. Maybe we should turn this into a company. So we set up a company with a few friends over the internet. And then in kind of the Java Eclipse space, but it was related to a Microsoft technology, figuring this is completely safe. Microsoft would never, ever, ever want to be anywhere near this, because it's all Eclipse and Java and whatnot and open source related. And then, wouldn't you know, Microsoft started to change as a company. And then so we started that company in 2005. And then in 2009, Microsoft actually acquired the company that me and a few of my mates did. It's just a small company called Team Price. And then did that, came over to Microsoft, helped Microsoft kind of get open source a bit better and help a bunch of that stuff. And then created Microsoft's GitHub account, was very friendly with GitHub as part of the work I was doing and with the Git community as well. And so then when we came to look at seriously, would we be a good home for GitHub? I was kind of part of the acquisition team over that side. And then after the acquisition happened, I was lucky enough to be offered a role over at GitHub. So that was fantastic because as one of my former managers at Microsoft told me, I never quite belonged there. I never really fit in. And so GitHub is definitely a great home for me. And I love it over here. Love the culture, love the people. And obviously the community is superb.
Amazing. Yeah, that's a great story. So yeah, you clearly have quite a long track record in the open source world. So, I mean,
I'm old. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm old and don't have much hair left. I used to have hair when I was doing this. So yeah, all good.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of us. I'm not young. Let's put it that way. I've been around the block a couple of times as well, but I'm still
it's
curious.
The weekend before FOSDEM, and so I'm quite looking forward. I'll be at FOSDEM this weekend just after we're recording, and
nice.
It's very reassuring. I mean, last year it was kind of back to how it was pre-pandemic. And it's very reassuring to see that, while, yes, you sort of see some of the same characters around, it's not all of the same characters. And there's plenty of new young people coming in to the open source community. And even better, the people that are coming in now don't all look like me and you. There's a lot more diversity in the people that are joining. But also diversity of where they're coming from. They're not all from, Europe or North America. They're kind of spread around the world. And that's definitely represented both when you see the community in person, but then as we start to dig in and look at some of the numbers as well, we really start to see that.
Yeah, and that segues perfectly into the first two topics I've had here. So, whoa, right. Imagine that. Literally the first one that I
didn't know this. This is not a setup. So
I know, exactly. It's amazing. Literally the first line I have here is 2023 saw the largest number of first-time open source contributors, according to the Octoverse 2023 report. And my question was, why do you think that is? What was the catalyst that made 2023 be such? Because I mean, I am passionate about getting people into open source. So seeing that was like, that's great. But now I want to know what triggered that.
Yeah, it is good because we saw a boost, in the 2021 numbers, which I think actually was kind of the pandemic effect. Because, so many people were stuck at home and were kind of wanting outlets and things. And so as software developers, we were kind of, doing more open source. And so we saw a really big peak in 2021. And that then actually, it declined a little bit in 2022. But if you look at the graph, it's still showing an upwards trend from where it was in 2020, 2019. The curve still plots kind of thing. It was just a slight peak. And so this year was definitely, or the 2023 year was definitely one we were very, very interested in seeing. Like, are we going to see a downward trend from that 2021 and level out? Or are we going to see the curve increase? And so to your point, we saw the curve increase to such an extent that it was beat the 2021 number of first-time open source contributors. So, and that's more than ever have contributed to open source ever in the history of humankind, and this is just using GitHub numbers as a proxy of general open source contribution. And so that's when we dig in and we kind of looked as to why. We saw a few things. One was Every country is growing, but some countries are growing more, and we can dig into the particular regions which are growing, substantially bigger than others. But we also saw it's very interesting looking at the projects that are attracting first-time contributors, and it's like things like VS Code and stuff, which it's a tool which everybody uses. But people are actually prepared to contribute to it, which kind of says a lot about how they set up the architecture of VS Code and the community and how welcoming it is. We did see a few projects like, the Stable Diffusion Web UI project, which everybody sort of was playing with last year. Previously, like in years past, we saw a lot of projects to do with like generative art as people were generating, NFTs. I was going to insert a value judgment on those, but as people were generating art, we saw like those projects boost up, and they've obviously dropped back down again. But we're seeing lots of people getting involved in kind of these generative AI projects, which is really good to see, because obviously like Gen AI and open source is it's an interesting relationship right now. But the ones that are out there that are open source related, seeing massive kind of communities getting on board. And then we see the usual suspects like Home Assistant, which is what I use to power my house. Like that is a massive community. Flutter is another big community out there as well. And then we also see people like Microsoft, like IBM, Red Hat. Like they push a lot of their documentation and they collaborate on a lot of that kind of stuff in the open nowadays. And that's an easy kind of first entry into the open source world. You don't have to know how to write C99 and send a patch file to a mailing list. You can go on, edit a markdown file in a web UI, send it off as a pull request, which you're kind of used to anyway, and boom, your contribution is now benefiting all of humankind kind of thing. So it's kind of a different, where people are coming from, what they're contributing to, but also kind of lowering the bar in terms of how easy it is to make contributions in open source things. I think it's a combination of all of them, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure. And I was thinking as you were talking, I would assume that all the resources that GitHub has pushed into improving and giving you a whole bunch of tools just on github.com has also lowered that entry, because previously it was like you kind of had to pull up your terminal and learn some Git commands to just do a simple fork. And if you just wanted to do a simple patch, I mean, now you could just press the little period key on your keyboard and it opens a web editor, and like, so if you just want to make a quick contribution to a documentation thing because you were reading the docs and you're like, oh my goodness, here's a little thing. And I think also a lot of the documentation, like I guess you call it boilerplates, like Starlight from Astro and Docusaurus and those. Yeah, they just come bundled with these edit links now on the page. And if you click that, it takes you straight to the source on GitHub. You press the little period key and you're off to the races. Like I think that is probably also a big factor in why so many people are contributing now.
I hope so. It's definitely something that we're trying to make easier. And I know, interestingly, as I say, I'm off to FOSDEM at the weekend. Not everybody in the community agrees. Like some people deliberately kind of put gates in place as almost like you need to figure this level out before we'll even take your contributions, because they're kind of worried about the level of contributions. But I think if you're trying to get contributions from a broad community, if you're trying to get contributions that improve, say, your help and your documentation and things which aren't that C99 code that talks to some obscure cryptography library, then making it as easy as possible to contribute is probably a good thing as far as the progress of open source is concerned. But every project should kind of set their own boundaries, I think, and decide how they want to run their communities. So it's a fascinating time to be around and sort of see how everybody's changing, how everybody's kind of improving and getting better at making these changes. I've got an interesting story actually about, like, it's not an entirely positive story about those edit buttons in documentation. Mm-hmm. So we kind of we have open source libraries like everybody else in GitHub. We have most of what makes GitHub is available as an open source library that people can go build and put together. And our documentation, like a lot of people, is also open source, and you can go in and you can edit it. We were seeing a ton of what we were thinking was spam in, like spam contributions in the documentation, but it wasn't like traditional spam that we have automation that and rule and logic that can detect and weed out, like people trying to insert links and trying to do all this sort of stuff. It was weird. It was like random text. And we were like, what's going on? And it wasn't coming from like bot accounts, like accounts that had been created and then sent some spam and like kind of inactive. It was accounts that were perfectly active and didn't look spammy elsewhere. Super weird. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. And we did tons of iterations, and we were looking at different product improvements, looking at different things, trying to find rules and stuff. And eventually, after much looking, we looked at the data, and we were seeing that a lot of these pull requests that we were getting, they were disproportionately coming from mobile devices, specifically Android. And we were like, what is going on here? And then, as most problems end up happening, it came down to a developer hunch. And one of the developers was like, I'm going to bring up the doc site on my Android phone and see what's going on. Brought the doc site on their Android phone, and they noticed that the edit button was massive in Chrome on certain flavors of Android. And so especially non-English speaking people were like pressing a button trying to get out of documentation, hitting it, and then they went straight into the edit PR page, and then they'd no idea what they were doing, and then so they were hitting random characters to try and get out. And that's how they were submitting what we were calling spammy pull requests. It was actually our fault. We were kind of DDoSing ourselves by confusing our users. And so we kind of tested that hypothesis by just disabling the edit button on Android to begin with and see if that worked. And boom, all of the spam went away. So then eventually we made an edit button that was, correctly sized in the CSS on that browser, and also didn't take you straight into the it took you to the file. It didn't take you straight to the edit page that then put you into the dialog. So it's an interesting thing how user experience and when you start to see spam or when you start to see weird results is to try and track the motivations of that stuff back and understand why that was happening to you. But yeah, otherwise, open source documentation is a fantastic success. Don't let me put you off, but be careful.
Yeah, for sure. But that's super interesting. I think it's one of those situations where I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and it reminded me of this whole thing where if your phone drops down to like 3G type connections, like a decent 3G, you realize how little of the internet you can access. And I think it's one of those things as well where you don't really test because you're like, I don't know if people still use this thing on the specific ancient version of Android, but there are still people using it. And I mean, I understand there's the technology itself, but also so the technology we use to build the things and the things we build move so fast that it's really hard unless you have massive teams and a ton of resources to be able to always go back. You have to at some point make a cutoff and say, oh my goodness, I just hope this doesn't break the world for somebody that's trying to use our application or our website or whatever the case may be. But it's amazing that you were able to narrow it down and solve it. That's pretty cool.
Took us a while.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, and it was lots of false starts, and in the end, you just have to kind of follow the data, but it's following it in the right way. You can imagine all of the 199 wrong paths we took before we looked at the user agent of the people who were submitting stuff and tried to trace that back. So yeah, it's one of those things. But the number of times when you're doing some website development and, you know, it works fine, but then you open it up in some random version of mobile Safari or something, and it behaves completely different to the mobile, to like Safari on the desktop, or and it's always the devices that are hardest for you to test, that they're always the ones that are wrong. Always the way, but hey, that's how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I ran into a thing today where it was literally when you run the thing locally. So if you do npm run dev,
yeah,
everything's cool. When it's run through CI and it's published, the text is way over on the left-hand side. And it's like, what the heck's going on? So when you run npm run build and then you serve the stuff that it spit out on the other side, it messes up the CSS somehow during the build process. So that was fun. Those are always those bugs that's so hard to reproduce, because somebody was sending me a screenshot and saying like the text is not centered. And I'm like, what do you mean the text is not centered? And I sent them a video.
On my machine.
Yeah, I sent them a video where I'm like literally resizing the window like in Safari and in Firefox and in Chrome. I was like, I don't know what. And they're like, are you testing it just locally or are you testing the preview site as well? And I'm like, no, just testing locally. And they're like, check the preview site. And I was like, what's going on? And then I was like, oh, what's different between these two? The build step. And the build steps are messing it up. Go figure. Those are hard bugs to trace. But
definitely.
You mentioned about the countries, some growing much, and so I want to dig into that, because me being from South Africa, I've spoken to some other folks, and I'm always like, I mean, we've talked about why contribution in Africa is so low compared, because if you look at the map and you look at the heat map that's overlaid in the Octoverse report, like the entirety of the African continent is this like light purplish, like bluish color, right? Which means it's low activity. And so, I mean, one of the things that's an obvious reason of why this, well, one of the hypotheses of why this is because money, right? And access to stable, reliable infrastructure. When you combine those two, you're like, any free time I have is very little. And even then, I almost feel like I need to do something where I'm getting paid. So it's really hard to sell that value add where it's like, yes, but you could potentially grow as a developer or be seen by the right person by contributing to open source. So not only are you learning, but you could also like kind of network and find opportunities that could give you that. But it's like, yeah, but right now my family needs to eat. So that's where your focus is, right? And I think a lot of the countries that are growing now, because if I looked at the heat map, is like your South America, India, those kinds of areas. And they all have this thing in common, right? So I'm assuming what might be happening, and please, you'll know more about this than me, but could it be that some of these areas are developing economically, and as a result, people have that flexibility where they have that bit of free time where they feel like I can spend this doing some free work in quotes?
I think it's a combination. So there is definitely an economic issue. And it's not just free time, but it's also like the cost of bandwidth. You know, the cost of bandwidth in South Africa is substantially different to the cost of bandwidth in, you know, Ireland, where you've got every single thing like arriving as an interconnect rather than the cable going around the continent kind of thing. You've got access to equipment and machines. Literally the same laptop can cost 10 times as much on the streets in Nigeria as it costs on the streets of New York. Like, how does that work? Because I guarantee those people aren't getting paid 10 times more. And so, you know, and then there's, to your point, you know, the free time, the access to daylight, like the access to people having lighting as well as reliable internet. So yes, definitely an economic thing. Interestingly, with open source, we're seeing that the barriers are lowering now that, though, you know, lots of people in developing countries can get access to the internet now, and then especially through mobile networks and things, and are now using that access to further themselves, to grow, to build all the skills development that you're saying. What's really interesting that we see a lot, we see, for example, India is growing incredibly fast, and but it also has a great education system. It has a young population that's coming up and learning new skills. It also has like this kind of economic incentive there, because there are, like, India historically had like these GSI companies, the systems, large systems integration companies. So there were careers for people to aspire to go learn technology and then go into. And so it seems to go through these phases where you have to like build some kind of core infrastructure. You have to have some companies in there to provide a career path. But then you notice like a pivot from kind of working for an established company to then being entrepreneurial. And you look at India today, and VIT is incredibly entrepreneurial. And that's because people grew up, they were learning technology because they knew there was a career path there, and then decided to be more entrepreneurial and go into that side, and kind of skipped going through the kind of corporate path. Fascinating. We see a lot of those people, and we see a lot of the community in general being incredibly keen on access to learning. And the pandemic helped those people enormously, because a lot of the content went online rather than in person. And so now these countries and these people have access to all these learning materials, a lot of which are available through open source projects. And they're able to go in and learn as if they were sat. You can take the Harvard CS50 class as if you're sat in Harvard. You can do that from anywhere in the world, as long as you have a cell phone connection and you have a computer that can play the videos, and you can, it's all run on a thing called GitHub Codespaces, which you don't even need a powerful computer. You can fire up a code space, and then we run that computer for you in the cloud, and you can access it from your Chromebook or whatever, so you don't even need like super high spec machines and things. So it allows those people to compete at the best. We see a lot more hunger from in those regions for learning information and for career growth. And so when you look at the motivations for contributing, a lot of it is related to networking, career growth, like learning new technologies, all that sort of good stuff. India is a standout. Looking at the way India is growing, last year it grew 36%, I think it was, year over year. Whereas, America is still growing. It ain't growing at 36% year over year. And so if we project kind of linearly, and this was dumb like Martin math, this wasn't, proper like data science or anything. But if we project forwards the linear growth that we're seeing last year, and project this forwards on the numbers, we actually see India could overtake the United States in terms of global, in terms of developer population in entirety by about 26, 27 kind of thing. And that's a huge change. But then we also see like in Indonesia and Japan, interestingly, growing massively, and Japan isn't a developing nation. So, what's going on there in terms of the technology growth and, people kind of getting involved again in open source. And Indonesia is one thing where it's definitely, economically related to people finding careers and building, in tech. Japan seems to be more about the technologies. It actually seems to be, Japan seems to be pretty far ahead when it comes to AI. And so economically, we're now seeing like a leveling of the playing field when it comes to open source. Where we're not yet seeing a leveling of the playing field is when you look at the countries that are involved in generative AI projects. That very much is the G20, that is the richer countries, rather than, again, because access to compute is still expensive, even though access to bandwidth has reduced. So, it's fascinating to kind of see at a global scale, though, how it works. And, it's really, really interesting. I think in Africa, Nigeria is definitely the top growing country on the continent. Again, good education system, very young population of people who are at school, and it's a very, very entrepreneurial population. They do have some large companies there, but really it's people are jumping straight into the entrepreneurial space. But then we're also seeing like, Ghana and Kenya growing quite fast. And Morocco has always been really big as well, but it's had a very kind of, because it's close to Europe, it has that nearshore kind of relationship. There's lots of, offshoring, nearshoring that happens in Morocco, which has always helped. So that's why it's always been big. And South Africa as well, as you know, has always been a big kind of, has a strong financial sector, which then helps it grow and kind of, perform. But it doesn't have the same population sizes and the same kind of, it doesn't have that same kind of population growth that some of the other countries are having as well. So it's fascinating to see.
No, it is for sure. And I also saw in the Octoverse report that the National University of Singapore, its School of Computing, like they've incorporated GitHub into their curriculum.
Yeah.
That obviously has an impact.
It really does, and lots of the larger tech schools do this now because they're trying to make transferable skills for people. And so if people learn how to use GitHub, not only can they do open source, learn from the best in the world, collaborate with the best in the world in open source, but they're skills that they can take via their employers as well, as more and more employers are using GitHub to build like the best as well. And so it's a transferable skill, and it also helps them learn. Singapore's really good at like kind of teaching real job skills. And so it kind of helps teach them how to collaborate with people, which, as you know, is basically 90% of our job is, working with others. It isn't sadly just coding on our own kind of thing. Singapore's crazy though, because it's it's got over 1 million people have GitHub accounts in Singapore. I don't understand that, because the population it's a city state with like 7 million people or something. And so if you go to a party, more than 1 in 10 people in that party will have a GitHub account. So I'm definitely taking my hoodie when I go to a party in Singapore. So should be good.
That's amazing. I noticed talking about like transferable skill and being valuable in the corporate sector, or just in the, not open source developers type thing, 80% of contributions are made to private repositories. I was surprised by that. And I think it's simply because I've kind of assumed, I've kind of looked at GitHub as the home of open source, and you would think that would default to public repos, right? But is this a change where a lot more has moved towards private repos, or has this always been the case that it's just now been surfaced?
It's the percentages have actually been fairly consistent over GitHub's life. It goes in different waves, but 80% is pretty common if you look over the past few years from memory. The last big change that we saw was that was about 2020, I think, when we did a change. It used to be with GitHub that if you wanted, you paid by the private repo basically. So if you wanted privacy, if you didn't want to do things in the open, then you paid for the privilege, and that was how GitHub was funded. GitHub changed its funding model around about 2020 to have a free tier, and that free tier include a certain level of private collaboration with teams for various reasons. One is to just encourage people to use GitHub for all their work, not just open source work, but also a lot of what we talk about in terms of ability to access this technology and compete like the best. It felt like the responsible thing to do to enable that, like rather than forcing people to do things in the open when they maybe shouldn't be. We wanted to make sure that being open was a deliberate decision, that you were deliberately collaborating when you were being open. You weren't just doing it to avoid paying us money, if you know what I mean. And then, so we saw a jump then. But yeah, you've got to remember as well, when you're being like, there's open source, which you do at the weekends and at home and everything else, and that's great. But when you pay to work on a project, hopefully you do quite a lot of work. And so if you're being paid to work on a particular repository, if you've got, 50,000 people in your company as developers, then they rack up a lot of contributions. And so you see a lot of that activity comes from private collaboration. So, yeah. But it is an interesting thing, because when people are looking at the scale, we kind of threw that number in because people kind of see the scale that GitHub's working at and things, and there's some fascinating engineering challenges that go on when you're trying to operate at that scale. And then when you realize, when you sit back and think, oh, hang on a minute, the stuff I can see is literally the tip of the iceberg. Like it's less than 20% of what's really going on under here. Crikey, no wonder it takes a while to roll out that change to the pull request UI, because it affects a lot of people. So yeah.
Yeah, and sure. I mean, I've seen this with the GitHub docs, for example. There was this bug where the sidebar, like the right-hand TOC sidebar, would be very, very light in light mode, almost to the point where you can't see it. Like if you don't have decent vision, you most definitely will not be able to see it. Yeah, and I actually felt the issue about it, and we had quite a back and forth, and then it kind of went quiet. And I was surprised that it wasn't addressed quicker, because I was like, this is a big thing, you know, why isn't it? And then a very good friend of mine works on the GitHub Docs team, and we were chatting, and he told me that you're just unfortunate that you're seeing it, because when we look at our stats, the people affected by that is like 0.35% of the people looking at the Docs website.
Yeah.
And therefore it's just deprioritized, which makes 100% sense, right? Because it's 0.35%. There's obviously other bugs that affect 80% of the code of people reading GitHub Docs. So when you need to, if you have limited resources again, you need to say, where do I put my resources? The 0.35% that's being affected, or the 80% that's being affected. It sucks for me and the other people who face that.
Well, that's the problem, because if you're yeah, exactly. It's even though you may be a small percentage of the population affected, it's affecting you 100% of the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing we're always trying to balance when we do that. I mean, that has been fixed now. I think that particular issue, hasn't it? I seem to remember.
It was fixed.
Yeah, I remember when that bug went in. I didn't realize you'd reported that one, so that was exciting. So. That team used to report to me until quite recently, so yeah, I do remember that happening. But it's that's actually something I have a bit of a problem with in general in terms of running services. One of the things that we like to do is actually look at when you run a big service, it's very, very easy to have a high 9 like uptime, because part of a service is up somewhere most of the time, you know what I mean? And so like if you measure, like, so you could kind of blur the lines and measure it at like whatever 100%. But one of the things we like to kind of do is kind of break down the experience per customer, and like what is the uptime for these people, and then look at the outstanding, like the, you know, what's the sort of 90th percentile uptime experienced, rather than what is the 99%, you know what I mean? And look at those kind of things a bit more, because again, if we've had problems with, say, occasionally like ISPs will do some routing issue and take GitHub out for an entire country. Not our fault, not something we've done, but we need to go fix it, because that's affecting 100% of that audience. And while our traffic might have not noticeably changed if it happens to be a smaller country, we need to go work with whoever the ISP is in that region to help them understand the impact of what they've just done. So it's the joys of running a large global service. This is why they call it work. But one of the absolutely the best things about GitHub is that our audience are developers. And like, so we only ever talk to developers really, or people who kind of understand tech. And so if you explain what's happened and why, and you explain why it's a problem, like, as long as you're not being stupid, then people are generally super nice, because they're like, oh, wow, yeah, that's a hard problem. Phew, I'm glad that one's not mine. Whereas, like, I used to work in one of these real jobs I had was doing IT for healthcare professionals. Oh my goodness, doctors are shouty. Like if you got a problem, they scream and shout at you, because they're like high paid consultants. They're used to people bowing to their every whim, and when you tell them, sorry, computers can't do that, they're like, you know, all that sort of stuff. So our audience are the most delightful, nice people that you just have to not BS and just be open with. And then generally they're like, yeah, okay. And yes, if it's 100% affecting you, you can get very upset about it sometimes. Why aren't they listening? Why aren't they understanding me? And it's very hard to say to somebody, I know it's affecting you. I appreciate that this is a real issue for you. However, it's like you are, there are 100 and odd million people on the platform, and I'm sorry to say you're a very small percentage of the people this is affecting right now, but we will get to it. It's just not the top priority for us at this moment. Or there's other times where it's like, yeah, we don't kind of agree with what you're saying there. Like, I appreciate you want to do it that way, but we actually want to go this way. And sometimes you get disagreements of thinking, because people love GitHub so much, because GitHub is their home where they spend a lot of time, it's where they meet a lot of their community. People get very, very passionate about that experience. And so it's, part of my job is helping people channel that passion into the right places to ensure that they get listened to rather than just feeling like they're shouting into the void. That's what I don't want to happen, because that's just frustrating for them and frustrating for everybody, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to admit that, because I know a lot of people are sensitive to the whole thing of it's only 0.x%. So therefore, like I think especially like myself, who are, I'm passionate about web accessibility, and this is a common phrase you hear. It's like, yeah, but it's like only 1% of our users. And then it's like, okay, how many users do you have? Well, we have got like 17 million. Okay, what is 1% of 17 million? And then it's like, okay, if you put it that way, but then, then you have
but you're unlocking a lot of GDP for the world by opening up to that percentage of people. And we talked about a bandwidth earlier. One of the things that we found, we've been trying to do a lot more kind of accessibility improvements across the site. I hope you might have noticed, like we've been trying anyway. We've been doing a lot of work on it. Okay, great. So, but we're finding lots of ancillary benefits that, affect everybody who isn't temporarily physically enabled kind of thing. It helps every single person, whether it's people who have bandwidth issues, whether it's people, we actually find that the UIs we create tend to be a lot easier to test, tend to be a lot introduce a lot less defects across different browsers, because again we've had to do it in a compliant way that works with different readers and works across browsers. And so while it can feel like attack sometimes, it actually enforces we found it to be a net positive for all of our users to do that work. There's diminishing returns. Like we have a bunch of videos right now, and the we embed the YouTube video player, and the YouTube video player isn't the most accessible video player on the market. We could do better, but that would mean going to a whole different service. And it would also mean that the accessibility of those videos for people who only have whose ISPs and things allow YouTube, because they can't not allow YouTube, but they would maybe block some random video serving site. So you're kind of weighing things up there a little bit. But for the vast majority of time, it definitely makes it better for everybody, is what we've found. So yeah, which is a positive, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure. And as you said, GitHub, for a lot of people, it's a very personal thing almost. Like it's this company, in the United States, but for a lot of people, it feels more like, no, this is where I meet my friends and we make cool stuff. So, but I think one of the things is what we've seen in open source. If we get to maybe the more serious side of things, then it is like the supply chain, which people have different feelings about. Like I don't quite like the supply chain thing, but in a way, in essence, what it boils down to is the supply chain, is the security of this. Now, there's a lot of different companies that has jumped up and trying to solve this. GitHub is also doing from their side quite a lot, and I think that is one of the things that was part of the Octoverse report, is the state of security in open source. I'd like you to dig into that a little bit and some of the new stuff, or maybe some things that's been around on GitHub for a while, but is now really fully baked. For example, is a really simple thing that I just love is that I can summon Dependabot now with a @Dependabot, which I've always been like, why can't I just do that? Then I always have to go copy the @Dependabot rebase or a recreate thingy. Now you can just summon it @Dependabot and tell it what you want it to do. Small little thing, but that's just a UX improvement. But I think in terms of security, like protected branches, GoodQL, secret scanning, all that kind of stuff, if maybe you want to unpack a little bit about what you've learned about the state of security in open source and what GitHub is doing about that.
Yeah, for sure. For addressing the sort of some of the community stuff first, I think what people rightly have a problem with is I'm maintaining this library for free in my spare time. You, Mr. Bank or insurance company, are not allowed to come in and tell me my stuff has to be secure. Like, it'll be what it is. I'm shipping it. If you wanna have requirements on me, give me some money. You know what I mean? Like So there is. I think when we're dealing with one of the things we try and do when we're dealing with open source security and talking to companies is constantly emphasize it's their problem, not the maintainer's problem. You know what I mean? It's like, and we're trying to do a lot to kind of raise awareness, especially within our commercial contracts and with our enterprises that we work with, that people who are working in open source are very often doing it for free, very often doing it in their spare time. And this is the respectful way to talk to people. This is how you approach the community. Raise awareness there. And I think we need to do that. And it's, we have to, we make money by hosting GitHub. We make money by serving those 80% of people that do things in private kind of thing. So we need to go do that. And I completely get where they're coming from. But what we need to do, therefore, is security is too hard today. It just is for everybody. And you, as an open source maintainer, you don't want to be spending your time like dealing with a bunch of blur and admin and creating CVE numbers and doing all that stuff. Like, you want to spend most of your time fixing the issues that affect you, fixing the issues that affect your community, and coding and solving problems. That's why you got involved. So we're trying to make it so the tooling and things is helping open source maintainers do the stuff they enjoy more and not do the stuff they hate as much or spend as much time on it. So you mentioned Dependabot. Dependabot's a great example where we make it available for free to open source projects. We obviously charge commercial companies for using it. That's one of those kind of free or paid features for private projects that we have. I think it was about 60% more Dependabot pull requests got merged in 23 than in 2022. So we're actually seeing a massive rise in people leveraging So what people don't know, if people don't know who aren't listening, Dependabot is a thing you can enable. It will tell you when it detects a library that you're pulling in as a dependency. It tells you when it detects a new version of that library because of a security problem, and lets you know what the vulnerability is, lets you know how to upgrade it. And it even sends you what's cool is it even sends you a PR which helps you upgrade it. Now, that's great, but as we all know, with open source dependencies, you get into kind of dependency hell sometimes, and one might want to be on this version, another might be on this. So we're doing lots of things to try and help address that side as well, because it still isn't as easy as it could be. But it definitely helps. And for me, when I see those, it helps me remind me that I need to go do this. And now, thankfully, if you've got your builds set up with GitHub Actions, so you've got some CI set up, you may be using Codespace or something. It's super easy to test that can I merge this easily? Does it work? Okay, great. I'll update the version, or do I need to do a bit more work and investigate it? So yeah, we're seeing a lot more people use it, which is good. The other thing that we switched on last year was some branch protection functionality. And we are we now have the ability to so branch protections is, control who can kind of push to a certain branch and things. And do you have to, can you push to main, or do you have to go via a PR, for example? One of the things that we switched on late last year was actually you can opt into this now, where you can have a protection for accidentally pushing secrets. So say if you were accidentally going to push a GitHub pat or your AWS key or an Azure key or something like that into your GitHub repo, it will tell you when you do the push, even from the Git command line, it tells you, hey, that looks like it contains a secret. Do you really want to do this? Now, what I love about the error message that they send back is it contains a URL that you can actually, command click on or control click on, whatever. And that will go back to the GitHub UI and it'll let you say, yeah, this is test data, or yeah, no, I really want to do this. And, you can get unblocked easily. So as a developer, it doesn't stop me doing my job, but it gives you that level of protection, because once you've pushed that secret out into the public, you can't take that secret back. It's now in history. Like doing a rewrite and force pushing is a nightmare. It's also out there. Somebody might have grabbed it. Basically, the only secure way is to rotate that secret to get rid of it. We do have some tooling which will automatically disable that token for you with people like AWS or Azure or GitHub apps, whatever. If you do accidentally push them, but it's better to just avoid it getting there in the first place. So we've got that. That's opt-in at the moment. One of the things we want to do in the future is make that opt-out. But we're letting it work for a while, seeing how people use it, making sure everybody's getting on fine with it. And then at some point we'll make it the default that people can opt out of if they don't want that kind of protection. But most people should have it on, to be honest. And then we're also seeing kind of a bunch of work around we're trying to help make it easier for security researchers to be able to responsibly disclose to open source projects when they found a vulnerability in their work, and do it in a way that doesn't zero day the entire community, and then help you as a maintainer create what's called a security advisory. And then from that, we actually are a CVE numbering authority now. So we can help you create those, like a formal, vulnerability number, which you can then create. And then we act as a registrar for it, so that, and then that becomes public data when you do that. Everybody in the world of a security tool can see that as a thing and can access it. It's not just, you're not just feeding Dependabot with cool data, you're feeding the whole universe of security tooling. So we're doing those things to kind of try and make security easier for maintainers and make it so it's less work for them, less friction, rather than pushing down the whole SBOM supply chain thing, which is kind of where you're kind of, we're trying to make it easier to follow along with, rather than trying to push down the needs of large organizations. For the large organizations, we do provide those tooling and things and help them with their private stuff and help them get data from, security improvements to the open source community. But really for the open source world, it's about how do we make your life easier. That's kind of the approach we take. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, totally. That makes sense. When you say with the secret scanning opt-in, how do people opt in? How do you know you haven't opted in? Where do you check?
I will send you a link to put into the show notes. But basically, it's a setting within the repo settings. You go and you look in there around code security. I think it is on the left-hand side. I'd have to actually look at that. I'll find the blog post where we explain it, and I'll send you a link.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that's great. I think I have two things that I'd like to touch on while we still have some time. The one is a topic that we hardly can not talk about when we think about 2023, and that is those two letters, A and I, that really blew up. And it's everywhere. And I think it's not entirely a people love it or hate it, but it felt there was a period of time where there was pretty much those two schools of thought. Some people thought it's the greatest thing ever. Other people thought it's the worst thing ever. I kind of started off on on the good side, went all the way to the other side, and now I think I'm kind of in the middle.
Okay.
My biggest concern, one of my biggest concerns, was around excluding people, right, from
Yeah.
this big change in how essentially the world's going to work. When the internet came about, it changed everything.
Yeah.
And there was this digital divide that people talked about, right? That happened. And I think one of the things that I was
Very
really
real with seniors and things like that as well. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was really worried about that. Are we going to do that again now? We're going to have those who have and those who have not, right? And so as a result, I was on the kind of negative about it. I was like, how many people are going to lose their livelihoods due to this? How many people are going to be able to participate? And again, talking from an African perspective, right?
Yeah.
If you think about compute power,
Yeah.
I have a M2 MacBook Air with 8 gigs of memory, right? But if I try to run even Whisper on here, this thing struggles. I can almost do nothing else. I just have to let it do the transcription from audio, and then I can carry on and do something else. Now, thankfully, we have Hugging Face. that is what a lot of people are calling the GitHub for open source. For open source LLMs. That allows you to run a lot of these things in the cloud on super powerful hardware for free for the most part. But so yeah, that's why I was really concerned about it, and I still do have some of that concern there. And I think it's healthy. We shouldn't just let go and jump all the way on the other side of the pool. And I think Microsoft and then GitHub has really embraced this, and some people didn't like it. Some people really didn't like it. Other people are super excited about it. So it's totally a mixed bag, and I think it will be for a while. And I think a lot of it's based on the uncertainty of, this is new. I'm not sure how I feel about this yet. Now it's everywhere, and I don't know what to do about it. I can't avoid it. It's everywhere. What do you think about the whole AI renaissance and how it's just filtering and everything? Because I think open source plays a key role here. Clearly when Google came out and said we have no moat because open source is one when it comes to this whole AI thing, a lot of people were like, well, that's interesting. So I think open source is a key player here, right? Hugging Face and other open source Meta has been amazing jumping into the open source AI space. And all the thing, they've just donating more and more stuff into as open source, true open source also, not just open source friendly. I just like to know just your thoughts basically around GitHub's embrace of AI and AI into GitHub, and then just more broadly, from personal, how you feel about this whole change in technology.
So I think it's important to acknowledge there is a hype cycle around the AI stuff, and it's so easy. One of the problems with LLMs is it's so easy to have a proof of concept demo. You get the prompt right, you do a demo in the happy path, and this thing looks like it's magic, But the minute you veer off the happy path, or you start to try and do strange things to the prompt, then things go horribly, horribly wrong sometimes. So building a product that people will actually pay for that's based on LLM is significantly harder than, as the Copilot team at GitHub will tell you, than just shipping an LLM, than just doing an LLM demo. But they're one of the ones that have been successful. And one of the reasons is because they're considering the ethics of everything up front and building things as they go. One of the key things when we were launching Copilot, we had an internal discussion around the haves and have-nots. And so we made it free for students and teachers, because we realized that one of the concerns is going to be, well, all the kids can cheat on exams because it's Copilot is ridiculously good at doing, leak code kind of questions and things like this. It's amazing and that sort of stuff. So we knew we needed to make it available for teachers for free as well, to kind of understand how it should be used responsibly. And, just when imagine imagine if Casio could have given everybody for free pocket calculators in schools when they launched calculators, but we have the ability to do this with software, which is pretty cool. And then we also give Copilot away for free to the maintainers of like the most popular open source software. We can't make it free for everybody who contributes to any public repo, because that's basically everybody. And as you point out, it costs an insane amount of money to kind of run these models and things like that. Like there's a non-trivial compute cost there that we have to be responsible with. But we factor in how many people do we have coming in through the pay channels? How much do we have? And then use that to kind of help us, provide access to Copilot for everybody else. So that's important for us. The other thing that's fascinating is making sure that your tools are used in a responsible way. So we very deliberately keep you on track for programming questions with Copilot. Sure, because there is compute cost there. And while you might be paying through it, we're still using electrons. And while all of our electricity is green, is from renewable sources, if we weren't using it, somebody else could be using that same renewable energy. So while we're not personally burning a tree for you looking up a taco recipe in ChatGPT or whatever, it's not free, you know what I mean? Those electrons are being those are resources that are being consumed from the planet, and so they should be used in a responsible way. And so again, we try and constrain the Copilot, GitHub Copilot, to be answering questions around programming stuff. We look at people's intent. We try and help make sure that we're not helping you do fundamentally bad things, define bad however you want. And then the suggestions that come back are unique, are as secure as possible. We run models on the results that get back to make sure we're not teaching you an insecure way of coding, that we're trying to teach you a more secure way of coding. We're slowly trying to improve the state of the art of the code suggestions that come back. So all those things are important. I think in general around AI, one of the interesting data points from the Octoverse report is that I mentioned this earlier. If we look at the top 10 countries doing open source, we see one set of results. But when we look at the top 10 countries doing generative AI, it's US, India, and then you see a sharp drop, and then it's Japan, Hong Kong, UK. It's richer countries. Brazil's up there, but it's the fairly rich countries plus China, and Singapore's up there as well. So there's obviously an issue when it comes to local compute, and that's where providing access to the cloud, I think, is super important. Providing access in as easy way as possible. And then one of the fascinating benefits of large language models is that they are amazing at translating between human languages and programming languages and vice versa. And so while you can ask Copilot in English, please explain this code to me, you can just as easily ask it in Hindu, in one of hundreds of different languages and dialects, and it knows enough in its training set about most languages that it can give you a really good answer in your local language. And so back to our earlier point about democratizing access, hopefully by providing access to some of these functionalities around explain this and can you do this for me, bridging between natural languages and programming languages, we're kind of again increasing the access to who can be a developer to a broader set of people, and not requiring college level English as a requirement to be a software developer anymore, which is great. But back to your original point, well, what does that mean about careers and jobs and all this sort of stuff? The day that a customer can tell you what they want, then maybe a computer stands a chance of doing it. But actually, you still need computational thinking. You still need to know how to break down a problem and solve it in a creative way. What's the minimum? Like, we all know, like, whenever you're doing optimizations of programs and things, the trick isn't to get the computer to do more work quicker. The trick to do optimizations is to get the computer to do less work. And that's the same thing whenever you're automating any kind of processes, whenever you're making any improvements, whenever you're building any software. The way you get the computer to do stuff is to make it do less work, really, rather than do more work quicker. And that is a creative act. That is a problem-solving act which involves the creation of original ideas. Computers do not do that. They do not create ideas. Computers are now good at language, and that's a new thing. And they have this ability to translate between programming languages and natural languages. This is a new thing that's happened, since 2018. But they're not creative, and so we still need people to be able to do that. And we also need to make sure as we're doing that we bake safeguards in all the way along. We're baking responsible use of this technology, both from an ethical point of view, but also from a resource point of view, and all that sort of stuff. And it's just behoovant on us, because this is an epoch, undoubtedly. Like, you've been around. We mentioned at the beginning, we've both been around a while. This is the biggest change I've seen since the internet probably came in. So while there is a lot of hype, it's deserved hype in most areas. And it's just behooving on us to make sure we build the systems that we want to see, that we're very conscious of our biases as we build these systems, so that we can make sure we're testing for the resulting systems to make sure we're not hard coding in the biases of ourselves into this next generation of systems. And just keep doing that as we go on, and keep testing for it. And thankfully, the community, as long as we provide them access to stuff and be open, the community will keep us honest, I believe, and the market will keep us honest as well. So I'm quite excited and quite positive about the future, if I'm honest. It's definitely very, very exciting. But I think it is up to us to do things in an ethical way as we go along. That's probably my old open source roots coming in there, though.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I think it's good. It's good to know that there are people that are thinking about it, and it's not just we need to put this into every system possible because it's the new thing. It's like, yes, but are we actually solving a problem by adding
there's a huge conversation we have about right size models around resource usage, and like making sure you like, for example, I'll give you right now in Copilot, you have you can be typing and it can give you code completions as you're typing, or you can ask a question in the chat interface and it gives you a response. When you're typing, the LLM behind that model is actually today, it changes over time because, we keep incrementing models, we keep improving things. Right now, it's it's GPT-3.5 Turbo is the model that it's talking to. If you're using the chat interface and then some other areas, that's using GPT-4. And so GPT-4, significantly greater context, oftentimes better results based on the context you're giving it. But the amount of energy consumption per transaction, the amount of resource consumption per transaction is a lot greater. If you're typing, you maybe don't need all that, and the amount of completion it's giving you is typically 1 line, 1 to 3 lines kind of thing. It's not a huge amount that it's doing. So we can use a smaller model that's faster, more energy efficient, and gives you the responses back quicker. For those kind of invocations, and all along the way, it's models upon models. So we're always trying to look at the right size model. What's the minimum amount of resource and energy consumption we can use to solve this problem as we go? And it's from a cost perspective as well from our side. Don't get it's not entirely altruistic, but it is definitely a conversation that's had. And no product can ship at GitHub without like those kind of review processes around that sort of thing. That's how we so it's good. You said it's good that people care about this. It is good that people care about this, but we also have to bake it into our shipping processes to make sure you are not allowed to ship a product unless you care about this. Like that's so it's enforcement as well as like encouragement, just like with accessibility, to be honest.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Yeah, for sure. So in closing, what are you looking forward to in 2024? Or do you have some like spitball looking into the glass ball, whatever? What do you think is going to throw up this year in open source, but then on GitHub in general?
Well, so one of the things I'm actually really interested, this is like super like nerdy niche like level stuff. I'm really interested to see where Japan and Indonesia end up in the community sizes next year. Indonesia in particular, because we saw such massive growth from both of them. I'm fascinated to see where they land in the table. I think we might also Brazil. I'm thinking we might see a change in terms of like the economies that are at the top of the open source kind of ecosystem. So that'll be interesting. We're seeing massive changes in obviously generative AI, but we're still at the early days. Like we're still at the equivalent of CLIs, rather than kind of different UI. So it's going to be interesting to see what this next generation of tooling brings. And then obviously, Apple just recently shipped their Vision OS thing. Personally, don't get it. Like I don't understand why, but I'm interested to see if that ends up being a thing. Like I own an Oculus, I own all of these things. I've not bought the dev kit yet, but I will play with one. Like those things are fascinating from a purely nerdy point of view, but I wouldn't have any predictions on that because I don't quite see it yet.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different ideas happening in technology right now. Yeah. It almost feels like when just before the iPhone came out, there was all these explorations of how we can use and consume technology in different ways and what's the modality that's going to stick. So I think we're at that point again now.
And we've seen how Copilot helps us as software developers. Like we were kind of spoilt. Usually new tools and technologies come to us last, but it just so happened that like with Copilot kind of leading the way, that the AI help within programming kind of came out early. We're now seeing that land with regular people, and you see things like AI summarizations of meetings and like, I hear my teachers at my kids' school talking about using AI to help them write school reports and things. And this is definitely, it's interesting. It's fascinating to see how it's going to affect the knowledge worker economy. But my son's studying computer science at university right now, my eldest son. And yeah, I was studying university in like 94 to 97. So, when I went to the computer lab, Mosaic was available, like the internet was just starting really, just kind of kicking off. He's coming into he's coming into his career as this AI wave kicks off and really kind of access to AI is a lot easier and a lot more consumable to the average developer. You don't need to be a PhD data scientist anymore. Like it's a lot more accessible. It's fascinating to see how that's going to impact his career. And but it's also seeing the amount of excitement that generation have in this space and that they the opportunities that they see. I'm positive, but it's very exciting times.
Well, thanks so much, Martin. This was a great conversation. Thanks for all the incredible information you shared and all the stories and stuff. It was great to just listen to everything. All I can say is all of the best for 2024 for you, for GitHub, for open source in general. I don't know if there's anything else that you'd want to close out with.
No, if you want to get a hold of me, it's just Martin Woodward on GitHub, and then that'll take you to my socials and things. But I'm thrilled to see where we go as well, and just thanks for being part of the community as always, and keep giving us the feedback to help make GitHub better. One PR at a time. That's all we can do. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Mechanical Inc. podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Have something to add? Continue the conversation on GitHub and join the community on Slack. Until the next one, keep all the things open.